They read the will on a Wednesday morning, the kind of gray October morning where the light never quite decides what it wants to be. I sat near the window in my nephew Gerald's law office, away from everyone else, the way you sit when you've already accepted you don't belong in a room, but nobody had the decency to say so out loud. My son was across from me. He didn't look at me once. Not when I walked in, not when he pulled out the chair beside his wife, not when the paralegal offered coffee and he said yes, thank you, and never thought to ask if I wanted any. 31 years. That's how long I'd been invisible to my own child. My name is Dorothy. I'm 63 years old. I have 2 bad knees, a house that needs a new roof, and apparently, according to my son Kevin, absolutely nothing coming to me from the estate of my late brother-in-law, Frank Caldwell, who built one of the most successful commercial real estate portfolios in the state of Ohio before a stroke took him quietly in his sleep 4 weeks ago. Kevin had called me the night before the reading, not to check on me, not to ask how I was holding up. Since Frank had been the closest thing I had to family for the better part of 3 decades, he called to tell me not to embarrass myself. "Dad already told me everything, Mom," he said. "I know you think you're owed something, but Frank made his intentions very clear before he died. You really don't need to be there." I asked him what his father had told him. He paused, and in that pause I heard 20 years of poison, carefully administered in small doses. That you've always had trouble accepting your place in this family. That you caused problems. That the best thing Frank ever did was keep the business away from you. I didn't say anything. "There's no tactful way to put this," he continued, and his voice had that clipped, impatient tone that used to belong to his father, but had somehow migrated into my son's mouth, somewhere around his 40th birthday. "Frank left you something. A gesture. $100, Mom. He said you'd understand what it means." I understood exactly what it meant. "I'll be there at 9, I said, and I hung up the phone. I should explain who I am, not who Kevin thinks I am, not who my ex-husband Raymond spent 22 years making sure everyone believed I was, who I actually am. I married Raymond Caldwell in 1989. I was 28. He was 32 and already working alongside his brother Frank, building what would become Caldwell Property Group from a single strip mall in Columbus into something that stretched across 4 states. I wasn't just Raymond's wife, I was his partner. Not on paper, never on paper, but in every way that mattered for the first decade of our marriage. I kept the books when they couldn't afford an accountant. I managed the tenant relationships when Raymond's temper made him useless in a negotiation. I drove 4 hours to Dayton at 2 in the morning when a pipe burst in one of their buildings and the property manager wasn't answering. I did it because I believed in what we were building, because I thought we meant something. Kevin was born in 1991. By the time he was 3, I was already seeing the cracks. Raymond had a temper and a drinking habit, and a very fluid relationship with the truth, particularly the truth about money. In 1997, a deal went bad. Not just bad, catastrophic. Raymond had signed a contract that committed Caldwell Property Group to a development project they couldn't afford, using collateral they didn't actually have. The kind of thing that ends with criminal charges and a company in ruins. Frank came to me. Not to Raymond, to me. He sat at my kitchen table with the papers spread out between us, and he said, "Dorothy, I need you to understand what's at stake." And then he explained that if this became public, if the banks called in the loans and the investors filed complaints, Raymond would go to prison. The company would be dismantled. Everything they'd built would vanish. I asked him what he needed. What he needed, it turned out, was a bookkeeper who was willing to sign off on a set of amended records. Records that would show the transactions as a series of personal investment decisions made by me, independently, without Raymond's knowledge. Raymond would walk away clean. The company would survive. And I, if the worst happened, would take the fall. I was 36 years old. Kevin was 6. I looked at my son's face in the school photo on the refrigerator, and I made the worst decision of my life for what I believed were the right reasons. I signed. Nothing happened for almost a year, and I let myself believe it was over. Then the audit came. Then the investigators. Then the lawyer Raymond hired, not for me, you understand, but to protect the company, sat across from me and explained, with genuine regret in his voice, that the evidence pointed unambiguously to my involvement and that cooperation would be in my best interest. I spent 14 months in a federal minimum security facility in Alderson, West Virginia. Raymond divorced me while I was there. He cited abandonment. Kevin was 7 when I went in. He was 9 when I came out. Raymond had spent those 2 years doing what Raymond did best, rewriting history. By the time I came home, my son looked at me with the eyes of a child who had been taught, very carefully and very thoroughly, that his mother was a criminal who had nearly destroyed the family, that she had been selfish, unstable, that she had made choices that hurt everyone who loved her. I tried. For years, I tried. I sent letters Kevin didn't answer. I showed up for school events he hadn't told me about. I sat across from him at mandatory holiday dinners organized by Frank, who felt guilty enough to keep including me, and I watched my son perform the role of dutiful child while treating me like a stranger who happened to share his last name. Frank never said publicly what he knew. That was the agreement. The company survived. Raymond thrived. Frank built something worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and my name appeared exactly nowhere in that story. But Frank remembered. That's what nobody knew. That's what Kevin had no way of knowing when he called me the night before the reading. Frank Caldwell had a very good memory and, as it turned out, a very thorough attorney. The office was warm in the way that offices are warm when there are too many people in them who would rather be anywhere else. Gerald, Frank's longtime attorney and a man I'd known for decades, sat at the head of the table with a leather portfolio open in front of him. Raymond was there, gray now, thicker around the middle, but still carrying himself like a man who expects doors to open before he reaches them. He hadn't spoken to me directly in over 2 decades. He glanced at me when I came in, and then looked away with the practiced ease of someone who had decided long ago that I was simply not worth the energy of acknowledgement. Kevin sat beside his wife, a woman named Patrice, who I had met perhaps 8 times and who had the politely frozen expression of someone trying very hard not to be seen taking sides. Kevin had his father's jaw and his father's certainty. He'd looked at me when I walked in, and the look was almost kind in its pity. The look of someone who already knows the ending and feels briefly sorry for the person who doesn't. There were others, Frank's 2 business partners, a representative from a charity Frank had supported, Frank's housekeeper of 15 years who sat very still in the corner and looked like she wasn't sure she was supposed to be there. I found out later she'd been left $85,000 in a paid-off car. Frank had been more generous than anyone knew. Gerald cleared his throat. He went through the standard portions first. The business interests, divided among the partners according to existing agreements, charitable bequests, a substantial gift to a children's hospital. I watched Raymond's expression as Gerald read, that careful, neutral expression of a man calibrating what he was hearing against what he expected, and I could see the exact moment he decided everything was tracking correctly. His shoulders settled. He took a slow breath. He was going to be fine. Gerald turned a page. To my brother Raymond Charles Caldwell, Gerald read, and Raymond sat up slightly, the way people do when they hear their full name read aloud in a formal setting. I leave the contents of the Lake Erie property, including all personal belongings and furnishings therein, and the sum of $100. The room went very quiet. Raymond blinked. Once. Twice. Kevin turned to look at his father. Patrice looked at her hands. Gerald did not look up. He turned another page with the calm efficiency of a man who had been a lawyer for 40 years and had watched many rooms go very quiet. To my nephew, Kevin Raymond Caldwell, I leave the sum of $100 and my personal collection of first edition books with the sincere hope that he will one day read them carefully. Kevin's jaw moved. He didn't say anything, but his face did something I hadn't seen it do in 30 years. It looked uncertain. It looked young. Gerald set down the page he was holding and picked up the next one with both hands. He glanced up for just a moment, and his eyes found mine, and in 30 years of knowing Gerald Collins, I had never once seen anything in his expression beyond professional courtesy. But in that one moment, there was something else, something that might, in a different man, have been called quiet satisfaction. To Dorothy Jean Caldwell, he read, and my breath stopped. Formerly of this family and never properly of this record, I leave the following. I had known this moment was possible. Frank had told me, 6 months before he died, that he was changing his will. He'd called me on a Sunday afternoon, which was unusual, and he'd said, "Dorothy, I need you to come see me." I drove to his house in Bexley and sat across from him in the same study where he'd once spread those papers on the desk and asked me to sign my life away, and he looked at me for a long time without speaking. "I've been a coward," he said finally. I told him I didn't need him to say that. "I know you don't need it," he said. "I'm saying it because it's true and because I've owed it to you for 26 years and I'm 68 years old and I've had one stroke already and I'd like to stop carrying it." He folded his hands on the desk. "I built this company on your back, Dorothy. Raymond would have burned it to the ground in 1997. You know that. I know that. I let you take the punishment and I told myself it was because you agreed to it, because you chose it. And maybe that was even true. But I also didn't fight very hard to find another way. I looked out his window at the garden his housekeeper kept better than he ever had. "What do you want to do?" I asked. He told me. What he'd built over 31 years, the portions not already committed to partnerships and charitable trusts, amounted to a real estate portfolio worth, at current valuation, approximately $147 million. He intended to leave the majority of it to me. "They'll contest it," I told him. "Let them," he said. "Gerald's been with me for 30 years. The documentation is airtight, and I've written letters, for Raymond, for Kevin, explaining everything." He paused. "Whether that changes anything for Kevin, I don't know. But he'll know the truth. Whatever he does with it is his." I'd driven home that night and sat in my kitchen for a long time. I didn't feel what I expected to feel. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something closer to grief for the years, for the version of my son who might have known me differently if Raymond had been a different kind of man, for Frank, who I think genuinely loved me in the way that decent but flawed people love the people they've failed. I felt tired and sad, and something else underneath both of those things that took me a while to name. It was the feeling of being seen, after 31 years, of having someone say, "This happened, it happened to you, and it was wrong." Gerald read for 12 minutes. By the end, Raymond's face had gone the color of old concrete. He was very still in the way that large men go still when they're trying to decide whether to be angry or afraid, and he hadn't decided yet. Kevin was looking at me. He'd been looking at me since approximately the 3rd minute of Gerald's reading, when it became clear that the letter Frank had written the letter Gerald was reading aloud, in full, as instructed, was not a vague acknowledgement but a precise and detailed account of what had happened in 1997, who had made the decision, who had signed, why, what had been promised and never delivered, what my silence had cost, and who had benefited from it. Kevin was looking at me the way you look at something when you're trying to reconcile two versions of a thing you believed was simple. His father's face was still stone. When Gerald finished, he closed the portfolio. He asked if anyone had questions. Nobody spoke. I stood up. My knees hurt the way they always do in cold weather, and I moved carefully, the way I've learned to move when a room is watching, and I'd rather not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing me wince. I picked up my coat from the chair beside me. "Dorothy," Kevin's voice. I stopped. I didn't turn around immediately. I needed a second to make sure my face was ready. When I turned, he was standing. Patrice was watching him. Raymond had not moved. Kevin looked like a man who had been handed information that restructured everything and was still in the early, disorienting seconds of that restructuring. He looked like my son used to look when he was 8 years old and had been told something he didn't want to be true but couldn't find the argument against. "I didn't know," he said. It was the smallest possible thing he could have said. It was also the only thing that could have been the beginning of something. "I know you didn't," I told him. He told me. He stopped. He glanced at his father, and in that glance was something I recognized because I had felt it myself once, the particular vertigo of realizing that someone you trusted had spent years carefully editing reality on your behalf. "I know what he told you," I said. "I know exactly what he told you, Kevin, and I'm not angry with you for believing him. You were a child and then you were an adult who had been shaped by what you were told as a child, and that happens. That's not your fault." Raymond stood up then. He pushed back his chair with more force than necessary, and he straightened his jacket, and he said, with a precision I recognized from 2 decades of marriage, "I'll be speaking with my own attorneys this afternoon." Gerald, without looking up from the papers he was organizing, said, "Of course, Raymond. I'd recommend you review the documentation we're providing before you do. It's quite thorough." Raymond walked out. We listened to his footsteps down the hallway. The outer door opened and closed. Kevin sat back down slowly. He put his elbows on the table and pressed both hands over his face. And I watched my son, my 61-year-old, gray-templed, stranger-faced son, do something I hadn't seen him do in the better part of 30 years. His shoulders shook. Patrice put her hand on his back. She looked at me over his head, and in her expression was not the carefully neutral blankness she'd been wearing all morning. She looked at me with something honest and direct, and she nodded once, slowly, the way women nod at each other when there are no words for the particular kind of complicated thing being witnessed. I sat back down. I didn't touch Kevin. I wasn't there yet. We weren't there yet. But I sat back down, and I waited, and that felt like something. The $100. I should explain that. Kevin didn't know, nobody in that room knew except Gerald and me, that the $100 Frank left to both Raymond and Kevin was not random. It was not a casual cruelty or an arbitrary number. In 1997, when Frank came to me with the papers, he offered me something in exchange for my signature. Not immunity that was never on the table. Not money. Because the money didn't exist yet. What he offered me was a handshake and a promise, and to seal it, he pressed a folded $100 bill into my hand and said, "When this is over, Dorothy, I'll make it right." I'd kept that bill for 2 years. I'd had it in my wallet when I was processed at Alderson. They'd cataloged it with my other belongings in a paper bag. When I was released, it was returned to me, slightly worn at the fold lines. I still have it. It's in a frame on the wall of my spare bedroom. Frank knew it was there because I'd shown him, the Sunday we sat in his study, when he told me what he planned to do. He left Raymond and Kevin each $100 because it was the amount of a promise he'd made and never kept. He was returning it. He was closing the account. Some things can't be reduced to a dollar figure, and Frank knew that. But he also knew that symbols matter. That numbers mean things when enough people in a room know what they represent. That the $100 he left Raymond was not an insult, it was a receipt, a final accounting. This is what you cost her. This is what I owe. This debt is cleared. I drove home that afternoon through the gray October light, through neighborhoods I'd watched change for decades, past the elementary school Kevin had attended, past the hospital where I'd had minor surgery 3 years ago and sat in the waiting room alone, past the coffee shop where I went every Tuesday morning because the woman behind the counter remembered my order and asked about my garden, and it was the closest thing I had to being known by someone. My phone rang when I was 2 miles from home. Kevin's number on the screen. I pulled over. I don't answer the phone while driving, a habit I developed late in life when I finally accepted that nothing is urgent enough to justify what can happen in one unguarded second on a highway. Mom. His voice sounded scraped clean. The way a voice sounds when someone has been crying for a while and then stopped and is now operating in the careful territory on the other side of it. Is it okay if I call you that? I closed my eyes for a moment. You can call me that, I said. You can always call me that. He was quiet for a beat. I read the letter, the whole thing. Gerald gave us printed copies. Another pause. I read all of it. Okay, I said. I don't know what to do with it yet. He said. I want to be honest with you about that. I grew up with one version of this story, and I just found out today that the version I had was, he stopped. I heard him take a breath. I'm not making excuses. I'm just telling you where I am. I know where you are, I said. I was there once. It takes time. Were you angry? He asked. All these years? Were you? Yes, I said. Because he'd asked honestly and he deserved an honest answer. Yes, Kevin. I was angry. I was also many other things. I still am. But anger isn't the thing I want to lead with you. It never was. The line was quiet between us. Patrice wants to have you to dinner, he said, not right away. Whenever you're ready. Whenever that seems, she said, whenever you're ready. I looked through my windshield at the gray sky and the yellow leaves and the ordinary Tuesday afternoon world carrying on the way the world does, regardless of what happens in law offices and hospital rooms and all the other places where lives pivot. I'd like that, I said. I'd really like that, Kevin. We talked for 20 more minutes. Not about the money, not about Raymond, not about the legal processes that would unfold over the coming months. We talked about small things. He told me Patrice was learning to bake bread and that their youngest was applying to colleges. I told him my garden had done well this year despite the drought and that I'd finally gotten the kitchen ceiling repaired. It was not a reconciliation. Reconciliation takes time. It is made of small moments, accumulated slowly, of trust rebuilt in careful increments, of old wounds that have to be spoken before they can begin to close. We were not there yet. We were at the very edge of yet, standing at a threshold, looking at each other across 30 years of absence and asking if passage was still possible. I think it is. I think about Frank sometimes, about the man he was and the man he failed to be and the years in between when he could have made different choices and didn't. I don't spend a lot of time being angry with him, which surprises me when I think about it. Maybe because he knew he'd been a coward and said so out loud. Maybe because he spent the last years of his life trying, in the limited and imperfect way that people try when they've left things too long, to make it right. I know people will say the money changes everything, and I'm not going to pretend that having financial security for the first time in 3 decades doesn't matter. It matters enormously. It means a new roof and 2 working knees, eventually, and the ability to stop calculating every expense against every other expense in a kind of perpetual mental arithmetic that has been the background noise of my life since I was 38 years old. But it's not the money that stays with me when I sit in my kitchen in the morning with my coffee. It's Gerald's voice, reading my name. Dorothy Jean Caldwell, formerly of this family and never properly of this record. Never properly of this record. That's what he wrote. Frank wrote that. He'd thought about how to say it for years, I think, and he found the exact right words. I was there. I was always there. I was just never written down. Now I am. Now there is a record, and my name is in it, and the truth is documented in a leather portfolio in a law office in Columbus, Ohio, and whatever Raymond's attorneys attempt, and whatever courts decide, and whatever lengthy and exhausting legal processes lie ahead, the truth exists. It was spoken aloud in a warm room on a gray October morning in front of witnesses. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, the thing I have wanted for 31 years, longer than I wanted any money, longer than I was capable of articulating without it sounding like self-pity. To be seen. To have the record reflect what actually happened. To exist in the story of my own life as something more than a footnote, an absence, a problem Raymond alluded to vaguely when asked about his first marriage. I exist. I was there. I did what I did, and it cost me what it cost me, and now the world knows, and somewhere in that knowledge is something that feels like being able to breathe fully for the first time in decades. Kevin texted me 2 days later. A photo, a small thing, barely a text at all, of a bread loaf Patrice had made, slightly lopsided, golden on top. He'd written, "She says she's getting better at it." I wrote back, "Tell her I'd love the recipe." He wrote back with a single word, "Soon." I held my phone and looked at that word for a long time. Soon. Such a small word. Such an enormous one. I put the phone down on my kitchen table, and I looked out at my garden, at the October garden going brown and quiet the way gardens do in Ohio when the light gives up, and I thought, I have today. I have soon. I have a son who knows my name now in the right way, in the true way, and a record that says I was here and I mattered, and what was taken from me has been named and returned as much as it ever can be. I'm 63 years old. My knees ache in the cold. I make coffee at 7 every morning, and I tend a garden that goes dormant in winter and comes back in spring without being asked. I have been many things to many people: wife, mother, scapegoat, prisoner, absence, footnote. I am learning now, in this late season of my life, to be simply myself. Dorothy, still here, still going. That's enough. That's more than enough. That, finally, is everything.